There are moments when a single page of paper changes the direction of the world. In 1939, a letter, signed by a name that carried both celebrity and a quiet moral weight, crossed a desk in Washington. It did not carry instructions, nor a plan, only a warning and a plea that the newly discovered phenomenon of nuclear fission might be turned into a weapon of unprecedented power, and that others, enemies of the United States, might be on that path already. That letter did not by itself build an arsenal. It did something more complicated and more human. It seeded urgency into a nation already braided with fear, and it pulled together a strange alliance of bureaucrats, soldiers, technicians, and scientists. Out of that tension, secrecy pushed against fear, genius pressed into service by necessity, the Manhattan Project grew. Imagine the world at the moment of the letter. Laboratories in Europe shuttered by politics and war, refugee scientists crossing oceans with little more than their notebooks, invisible equations tucked into suitcases. In Berlin and Copenhagen and Cambridge, experiments were revealing that the atom could be split and that the energy released was not merely theoretical, but enormous. These were not abstractions on blackboards. They were flashes of potential that could remake war itself. The letter, drafted by one mind, signed by another, and handed to a complacent government, was a hinge. It turned an academic curiosity into an emergency program. It transformed speculation into procurement orders, into maps, into guarded meetings in windowless rooms. It invoked the specter of enemies harnessing the same discoveries and made secrecy the first line of defense. The project that followed was industrial in scale and surgical in its secrecy. Government dollars flowed like a new river, enough to build whole towns in the desert and valleys of the American landscape. Laboratories multiplied, each a different answer to the same impossible question: how to release and control a chain reaction. In Tennessee, humps of concrete and the low throb of machines at Oak Ridge separated isotopes with machines taller than houses. In Washington and across the country, corridors of power signed away budgets and lives under code names. In the Pacific Northwest, Hanford's reactors became furnaces for a new element, plutonium, quietly generated in tubes of metal, the steam from their cooling towers rising like anonymous smoke into the sky. In a high plateau of New Mexico, a secret town shaped by straight streets and guarded gates drew together the talent to synthesize, measure, and test the unthinkable. What made these places work was not only money or secrecy, but an extraordinary convergence of minds. The people who answered the call were brilliant in disparate ways. Theoreticians who moved through abstract spaces of equations, experimentalists who could coax a detector to whisper the presence of a single neutron, engineers who could turn frail glass and brittle uranium into instruments of astonishing precision. They arrived with different temperaments and different histories. Refugees who had seen the worst of ideology, Americans who had little patience for abstraction, military officers who liked results measured in deadlines and blueprints. In the rooms where they met, language shifted from physics to pragmatics. Theorems became schematics. Moral qualms were cataloged and filed as problems to be deferred. They were careful, not only with their hands but with their mouths. Secrecy was not only a military necessity, it was a social rule, a promise that the truth, once revealed, would break more than glass. Secrecy had a sound. It was the low murmur behind guarded conversations, the clipped metal of badge checks at gates, the polished hush of a newly built laboratory. It also had a price. Many of the thousands who worked on the project understood only fragments of the whole. The town of Los Alamos was a collection of specialists who trusted other people's pieces of the puzzle without ever seeing the completed picture. That compartmentalization spared some conscience, but it also meant decisions were concentrated. A few people held the maps of consequence. For the scientists, secrecy meant isolation. For the soldiers and administrators, it meant power. For the project, secrecy was its shield and its moral fog. Fear moved beside secrecy like a shadow. The early engines of the project were fed by the possibility that Nazi Germany would marshal its own nuclear program. That possibility was real enough to justify urgency. The same science that could light a city could flatten it. The urgency sharpened minds and sped innovation. Ingenious solutions sprang from pressure. One team learned to enrich isotopes by spinning gas through staggering columns. Another learned to pull minute quantities of uranium through electromagnetic fields. Plutonium, meanwhile, required whole reactors and chemical separation plants, new forms of industrial chemistry that filled valley floors with containment ponds and process buildings. Progress came in fragments: a successful run of enrichment here, a reactor that held a chain reaction there. Each success raised the stakes, and each failure taught a lesson that would be paid for in time and resources. Then there was the moment of testing, when engineering became proof. On a July morning in 1945, the desert air above a remote site in New Mexico changed in a way it had never done before. The initial light was not merely bright, it was a new kind of daylight, a white that hurt to look at, and a heat that reshaped the ground. The blast, measured in kilotons of TNT, unrolled a cloud that ascended with stately, terrible beauty. Those present recorded it in instruments and their own stunned silences. They saw the city-sized power concentrated in a point. They saw, literally and figuratively, the culmination of disparate talents and secret labors. The test answered the lab notebook's questions. The physics worked, and the world had moved irrevocably into the era of nuclear weapons. What followed was the rapid translation of test into target. The machinery of war and politics combined, and in 2 strikes over 3 days, the new power was used on cities. The immediate human consequences were catastrophic: blast and heat, then a longer, more insidious toll of radiation and displacement. The spectacle of the mushroom cloud was followed by scenes no screen or photograph could render fully. Faces turned by pain, landscapes rearranged, communities undone. The bombs ended a war that had stretched across continents, but they also opened a new chapter in human history, one in which the capacity for destruction had leapt ahead of common human mechanisms for judgment and restraint. In the stillness after the detonations, the conversation turned from immediate strategic necessity to deeper reflection. The manifold consequences of what had been built and used could not be contained within bunker walls or classified files. The project's secrecy had been a practical wartime measure, but it had also created a culture of decisions made by few, with effects on many. The moral burden rested not just on those who pushed the buttons, but on a society that chose collectively, and sometimes reluctantly, to accept the terms of total war. The scientists who had built their instruments found themselves called upon to be witnesses, and in some cases advocates for the control and limitation of the very power they had unlocked. What the Manhattan Project also revealed is a paradox of modernity. Knowledge is both liberating and dangerous. The same theoretical insight that allowed physicists to understand the structure of matter also made weaponry astronomically more powerful. That duality, the capacity to make the invisible visible and the capacity to make the impossible devastatingly real, sits at the heart of current global dilemmas. The post-war years saw a shorthand of ideas: deterrence, mutual assured destruction, arms races measured in megatons. Secrecy did not vanish in the peace. It migrated into a new language of classified programs, intelligence gathering, and strategic ambiguity. Espionage tightened its sinews. Parallel to public pronouncements, a quieter race unfolded to understand, replicate, and sometimes subvert the work of those wartime laboratories. But history is not only a ledger of losses, it is also a record of responsibility and learning. The Manhattan Project's architects were not uniform in conviction. Many scientists who participated later devoted themselves to arms control, to public education about the risks of nuclear proliferation, and to the ethical stewardship of science. They helped shape treaties, advocated for monitoring regimes, and pushed for international mechanisms to manage a technology too consequential for any single nation to steward alone. Their efforts reflect an insight that grew out of what science had taught them, that human ingenuity need not be the handmaiden of destruction, and that knowledge must be paired with institutions and norms if it is to be safe. As time moves on, the physical traces of that secret race remain in concrete and in policy, but its greater residue is moral and cultural. The Manhattan Project changed not only the mechanics of war, but the way nations imagine power, security, and ethical responsibility. It taught us that secrecy can be a necessary instrument and a dangerous anesthetic. It taught us that fear can galvanize invention, but can also shortcut moral deliberation. And it taught us that genius, brilliant, particular, fallible, can be marshaled to ends both necessary and tragic. The story of the atomic bomb is, in that sense, a human story. It is about how we respond to information that promises both liberation and catastrophe. It is about how nations decide under pressure, how communities organize talent and resources, and how individuals reconcile the demands of duty with the weight of consequence. The one letter that alerted a president did not determine history by itself, but it opened a door through which many entered. Scientists, soldiers, bureaucrats, survivors, and later, citizens demanding accountability. Each of them carried the afterimage of what they had done or what had been done in their names. We live now in a world shaped by that choice. The light it generated is double-edged. It allows us to power cities and probe the universe, and it also reminded us how quickly we can turn brilliance into obliteration. The challenge we continue to face is not merely technical, but moral. To steward knowledge with humility, to build institutions that can translate secrecy into safety without quenching necessary transparency, and to remember that the capacity to create does not absolve us of the responsibility to choose wisely. In the end, the Manhattan Project is not only a tale of atoms and engineering. It is an examination of who we become when we believe that the urgency of the moment trumps the deliberations of conscience, and of what it asks of us when that urgency has passed. The desert where the first light rose is still there. The rusted infrastructure still marks the land, but the truer landscape is inside us. A map of choices, some made and some still to come. We learned to split the atom, and in doing so, we learned how fragile the line can be between illumination and annihilation. A lesson that asks with ever-renewing insistence what kind of future we intend to build with the knowledge we have unleashed.